They laughed, shoved him, and called him weak. But when the disabled man made a single phone call, the entire gang of bikers went from cocky to terrified. What happened next left the whole street frozen in silence. The city buzzed with life. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the sidewalks, where pedestrians moved in steady waves. Among them, a man walked slowly, leaning heavily on a pair of worn wooden crutches. His steps were deliberate, each one carefully measured, as if he had long since mastered the art of moving through a world that refused to slow down for him. He wasn't remarkable at first glance. His jacket was old, slightly frayed at the edges, and his jeans bore the signs of years of wear. But there was something about him, something quiet, something solid. His dark eyes scanned the street ahead, not with hesitation, but with the steady gaze of a man who had seen more than most. People passed him without a second glance. Some even maneuvered around him impatiently, as if his slow pace was an inconvenience. A businessman in a crisp suit brushed past him, barely acknowledging his presence. A couple laughed as they hurried by, caught up in their own world. But one man, an older gentleman sitting on a nearby bench, lingered on his face for a moment too long. He squinted, as if trying to remember something. His brow furrowed, his lips parted slightly, but before he could speak, the moment passed. The man on crutches kept walking, his face unreadable. Then came the sound that shattered the rhythm of the street. Engines, loud, aggressive. The unmistakable roar of motorcycles filled the air as a group of bikers swerved onto the curb, their tires screeching against the pavement. They weren't just passing through. They were making an entrance. People instinctively stepped aside. Some turned their heads and quickened their pace, pretending not to notice. Others stole nervous glances, unsure of what would happen next. The bikers weren't just a random gang. They owned this part of the street. Their leather jackets bore matching insignias, proof that they were more than just friends with motorcycles. They were a unit, a brotherhood, and they carried themselves like men who feared nothing. At the front of the pack was their leader, a tall, burly man with a wild beard and a wicked grin. His name was Duke, and he lived for moments like these, when the city belonged to him, when people got out of his way. Except one man didn't. The man with the crutches kept walking, steady, unbothered. He didn't glance up, didn't flinch at the sound of revving engines. It was as if they weren't even there. Duke's grin widened. "Well, well," he drawled, loud enough for his voice to carry. "Look at this poor guy. Think he's lost?" Laughter erupted from the gang. One of them, a lanky man with tattoos creeping up his neck, nudged Duke with an elbow. "Maybe he's just trying to get out of our way." Duke shook his head, his smirk growing. "Nah, he ain't moving fast enough." With a calculated flick of his wrist, he twisted the throttle of his bike, sending a sharp burst of noise into the air. The sound was deafening, rattling against the glass windows of nearby buildings. A few people in the crowd jumped, startled. The man with the crutches, however, didn't react. He simply continued his pace, step by step, moving forward as if nothing had changed. And that, more than anything, got under Duke's skin. "Hey, old man," he called, feigning concern. "You all right? Need some help?" More laughter. Another biker leaned forward, his voice dripping with mockery. "Careful, Duke. Looks like he might outrun you." The group howled with laughter. Still, the man with the crutches said nothing. But there was something about the way he walked, about the way he didn't acknowledge them, that made Duke narrow his eyes. Something about him felt off. And for the first time, just for a fleeting second, a small, inexplicable flicker of unease crept into the back of his mind. Duke swung his leg over his bike and stepped onto the pavement, boots hitting the concrete with a deliberate thud. The air around him thickened, tension weaving itself into the cracks of the sidewalk. The other bikers followed suit, their presence swallowing up the space, cutting off the man's path. The man with the crutches didn't stop. He adjusted his grip, kept walking. Step, drag, step, drag. The steady rhythm of his movement was almost defiant. Duke smirked. Guess he's deaf too. The bikers laughed again, but this time, their laughter carried a sharper edge. One of them, a stocky guy with a chain hanging from his belt, stepped directly in the man's way. Where you headed, old man? The man finally halted, his weight shifting slightly on his crutches. He raised his head, meeting the biker's gaze. His face was unreadable. No fear, no irritation. Just a calm, unsettling stillness. Through, he said simply. Duke let out a mock whistle. Ooh, we got ourselves a tough guy. Another biker, tall, bald, arms covered in crude tattoos, grinned. Maybe he don't know who we are. The man exhaled slowly. I know exactly who you are. Something about the way he said it, the measured control in his tone, made Duke's grin falter for half a second. But he recovered quickly, stepping even closer, his breath reeking of beer and arrogance. Then you should know how this works. You're in our way. You don't walk through unless we let you. A few bikers behind him chuckled, watching like wolves circling prey. Still, the man didn't flinch. His fingers curled slightly around the handle of his crutch, the only subtle sign of tension. Move, he said quietly. Duke's smirk twisted into something meaner. He reached out and flicked one of the crutches, making it wobble slightly. Or what? The bikers laughed harder. The stocky one mimicked the man's walking motion, exaggerated and mocking. Another nudged his crutch with the tip of his boot. The man exhaled again. And then, finally, he looked away from Duke. He reached into his coat pocket, slow and deliberate. The bikers tensed slightly, instincts kicking in. But he didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a phone. Duke scoffed. Oh no, he's calling the cops, he jeered, voice dripping with mock fear. Better run, boys. The others chuckled, but a few of them hesitated, watching as the man calmly tapped his screen. He raised the phone to his ear, and then he spoke. They're here. Just 2 words, no explanation, no elaboration. Duke's smirk wavered. The hell does that mean? The man didn't respond. His gaze stayed steady, his breathing even. He listened for a moment, then lowered the phone. No rush, no panic. And then, in the distance, the faintest sound of an engine. Not a motorcycle. Something heavier, smoother. The bikers exchanged quick glances. Duke's jaw tightened. Who the hell did you just call? The man slid his phone back into his pocket. A friend. Duke's grip on his belt buckle tightened. You trying to be funny? The man tilted his head slightly. No. A black car turned the corner up ahead. Sleek, unmarked, windows tinted so dark they were impenetrable. It slowed as it approached. The bikers stiffened. Duke turned to glance at the others, gauging their reactions. The stocky one licked his lips, suddenly looking less sure of himself. The bald biker shifted his weight uncomfortably. The car pulled up to the curb. The driver's door opened. A man in a suit stepped out. Not a cop, not a businessman. Someone else entirely. He adjusted his cufflinks, eyes scanning the scene. Then he turned to the man with the crutches and gave a small, respectful nod. Sir. Silence. The bikers went still, realization creeping in like a slow-moving shadow. Duke's smirk was gone now. Completely. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The man with the crutches finally shifted, stepping past Duke like he was nothing more than air. The suited man held the car door open for him. He paused before getting in, glancing back at Duke. "You should leave," he said, voice quiet but absolute. "Now." Then he slid into the car, and the door shut behind him. The car didn't speed off. It pulled away smoothly, controlled, disappearing down the road. And the bikers stood frozen, their arrogance now replaced by something much colder. Duke's fingers twitched at his sides. The sound of the car's engine fading into the distance left a ringing silence in its wake. His gang, usually loud, cocky, always ready to throw their weight around, stood frozen. None of them laughed anymore. None of them moved. The street, just moments ago filled with mockery and arrogance, had shifted. The air felt heavier. People who had been watching from a distance now pretended to look elsewhere, unwilling to get involved. But everyone had seen it. The way the man with the crutches had left. The way he had been addressed with respect. The way he had walked away, not as a victim, but as someone untouchable. Duke clenched his jaw. His pride itched under his skin, like a fresh wound. "Who the hell was that?" the stocky biker muttered, still staring at the spot where the car had disappeared. No one answered. Duke exhaled sharply through his nose, forcing a grin back onto his face, but it felt stiff. "Relax. Probably some rich guy with connections. Doesn't mean anything." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure he believed it. The bald biker, Reese, shifted uncomfortably. "Man, I don't know. That didn't feel right. The way that guy in the suit—" "Shut up." Duke's voice came out sharper than he intended. Reese did, but the doubt was already there, creeping into the edges of the gang's confidence. Duke couldn't have that. His eyes flicked down the street. The man with the crutches was gone, but that didn't mean he was untouchable. Duke had spent years running these streets, making sure people knew his name, feared it. A random cripple wasn't going to change that. "We follow him," he decided. "See where he's going." The others hesitated, but Duke gave them a hard look, and like always, they fell in line. They got back on their bikes. Engines rumbled. The gang pulled away from the curb, moving smoothly through traffic, eyes scanning for their target. Then they saw him. He was further up the street, moving at the same steady pace. Not hurrying, not checking over his shoulder, just walking. Like he knew they were coming. Like he didn't care. Duke's grip tightened on his handlebars. He gunned the engine, pulling ahead of the others. As he passed the man, he turned his head slightly, letting his voice cut through the air. "Hey, old man." The man with the crutches didn't stop. Duke let out a short, humorless laugh. "You think you can just walk away from us?" Finally, the man spoke. "I already did." Something in Duke's chest burned hotter. He jerked the bike to the side, cutting directly in front of him, forcing him to stop. The others followed, surrounding him in a loose but deliberate circle. People on the sidewalk slowed, watching but keeping their distance. Duke got off his bike, stepping closer. "You think you're some big shot, huh?" The man met his gaze, unfazed. "No." Duke narrowed his eyes. "Then what's with the attitude?" The man tilted his head slightly. "You tell me." That flicker of doubt was back, scratching at the back of Duke's mind. He pushed past it. "You're gonna tell me who you are," he said, voice lowering. "Right now." The man exhaled slowly. Then, with the same measured control, he reached into his pocket again. Duke tensed this time. The others did too. But again, it wasn't a weapon. It was the phone. He held it up, not dialing, not speaking, just holding it there, like a warning. Duke let out a sharp bark of laughter. "You think calling your rich friend is gonna save you this time?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he turned the screen slightly so Duke could see it. And the moment Duke's eyes landed on the name displayed, his smirk vanished. His stomach dropped. Because it wasn't just a name. It was a title. And it wasn't some rich businessman or a cop. It was someone who owned people like him. Someone whose calls weren't ignored. Someone who didn't just have power. Someone who was power. Duke swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. The phone started ringing. The man didn't break eye contact. He just let it ring, waiting, watching Duke's face change. And then, the call connected. A voice on the other end, deep, controlled. You have 30 seconds to explain why I shouldn't make you disappear. The blood drained from Duke's face. The gang saw it. They shifted uneasily, glancing between him and the man, realizing, too late, that they had picked the wrong target. Duke opened his mouth, but no words came out. The man with the crutches gave him one last look. Then he turned off the call. No words needed. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, in a voice so quiet it was almost kind, the man said, "You should leave." And this time, they did. Duke's body stiffened. His breath caught somewhere between his lungs and throat. The phone call had ended, but its weight lingered in the air, pressing down on him like an invisible hand, wrapped around his neck. His gang, once rowdy, arrogant, untouchable, now stood still, their confidence shattered, their bodies tense with unspoken fear. The man with the crutches pocketed his phone. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply stood there, calm, composed, watching them crumble under the realization of what had just happened. Duke tried to recover. He straightened his shoulders, forcing a grin back onto his face. But it was weak, shaky. "You expect me to just walk away because of a damn phone call?" The man tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "No," he said evenly. "I expect you to run." The words settled between them like a warning. And then, as if on cue, the distant sound of engines rumbled through the air. Not motorcycles, not street racers. Something heavier, controlled, precise. Black SUVs turned onto the street, their tinted windows absorbing the fading sunlight. They moved slowly, deliberately, like predators circling their prey. The bikers turned their heads, eyes wide with disbelief. Duke felt the first real wave of fear grip his chest. One of the SUVs pulled to a smooth stop just a few feet away. The door opened. A man in a perfectly tailored suit stepped out. He wasn't bulky like Duke, wasn't covered in tattoos or leather. But the way he carried himself, the sharp measured movements, the cold precision in his gaze, was infinitely more dangerous. His eyes flicked over the scene, assessing, calculating. Then he settled his gaze on the man with the crutches and nodded. "Sir." Just one word, just one acknowledgement. But it was enough. Enough to make Duke take an unconscious step back. Enough to make the bikers exchange panicked glances. Duke clenched his fists, his pride screaming at him to fight back, to do something, anything, to regain control. This is bullshit," he spat, voice hoarse. "You're just some cripple on the street, man. The suited man cut him off with a single quiet sentence. "You're already dead." Duke's heart stopped. The way he said it, so matter-of-fact, so inevitable, made the blood in his veins turn to ice. The bikers lost it. One of them muttered, "Screw this man," and turned to his bike. Another followed, nearly tripping over himself in his hurry to leave. The spell of intimidation had fully set in, and now all that was left was fear. Raw, primal fear. Duke stood his ground, his jaw locked, his fists clenched. He wanted to fight. He wanted to do something. But his body refused to move, as if the very presence of the suited man had drained him of whatever courage he had left. The man with the crutches took one step forward. Just one. Duke flinched. "You don't own this street," the man said softly. "You never did." Duke couldn't breathe. The suited man glanced at him, then at the bikers who remained, and gave a slight nod. "Leave." No threats, no shouting, just a command. And Duke, who had spent his life making people afraid, making them obey, felt the weight of it crush him completely. He turned, got on his bike, didn't say a word. And then, without another glance back, he and what remained of his gang roared off into the night, their tails tucked between their legs. The street fell silent again. The man with the crutches exhaled slowly, adjusting his grip on the worn handles. The suited man watched him carefully. "Are you all right, sir?" He nodded once. "I am now." Then, with the same steady, unbothered rhythm, he kept walking. This time, no one dared to stop him. The street was quiet now. The rumble of motorcycles had faded into the distance, swallowed by the hum of the city. People who had been watching from the shadows finally let out the breaths they had been holding. A few exchanged glances, whispering among themselves, still trying to process what had just happened. Duke and his gang, once the untouchable rulers of this block, were gone. Not chased away by fists, not by threats, but by something far worse. Fear. The suited man remained for a moment longer, his eyes scanning the street, making sure there were no loose ends. Then he turned to the man with the crutches, his posture still sharp, professional. "They won't bother you again, sir." The man gave a slow nod, adjusting his weight on his crutches. "They never should have in the first place." His voice was calm, as if none of this had affected him, as if he had seen worse. The suited man hesitated. "Do you need a ride?" The man shook his head. "Number, I think I'll walk." A small smile flickered across the suited man's face, almost imperceptible. With a final nod, he turned back toward the SUV. The door shut behind him, and just as smoothly as it had arrived, the car slipped away into the traffic, vanishing like a shadow. The man with the crutches stood alone once more. But this time, no one ignored him. No one brushed past him, as if he were invisible. The old man on the bench, who had earlier tried to place his face, now watched with newfound understanding, his lips parted slightly, as if a name had finally surfaced in his memory. A woman near the cafe muttered under her breath, "Who was that guy?" No one had the answer. But as he walked forward, step by step, slow but certain, everyone who had witnessed the scene understood one thing. He was not a man to be pitied. He was a man to be respected. The man with the crutches didn't look back. There was no need. He had walked through worse storms than this, and he would walk through many more. His pace remained steady, unshaken, as if nothing had happened. But for those who had witnessed it, everything had changed. The streets that had once been ruled by fear were now silent, with reverence. The people who had ignored him now watched him with quiet admiration. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't lifted a fist. Yet, he had left behind a message louder than any roar of a motorcycle engine. Power isn't about muscle. It's about presence. Respect isn't taken. It's earned. A young man leaned against a lamppost, still staring at the spot where Duke had stood just minutes ago. He let out a low whistle. "Damn," he muttered. "I gotta learn to handle things like that." The old man on the bench chuckled. "Kid," he said, shaking his head, "if you live long enough, you just might." The city continued moving, but the story would linger. People would whisper about it, speculate about who the man really was. Some would say he was ex-military. Others would swear he was connected to someone powerful. But the truth didn't matter. What mattered was that he had walked away on his own terms. and as he disappeared into the crowd, one thought remained: never underestimate the quiet ones. Have you ever seen a moment like this in real life? Let us know in the comments. If this story left you speechless, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because sometimes the best lessons come from the most unexpected places.